All right, so get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of drugs, addiction, and reward.
We're going to be focusing specifically on Chapter 5 from that behavioral neuroscience textbook, all about, well, drugs, addiction, and reward.
That's right. We'll be exploring how different substances can kind of hijack your brain,
Uh-huh.
making you crave them even when you know they're not good for you.
Exactly, and it really all comes down to this incredible network of neurons called the mesolimbocortical dopamine system.
But what system?
The mesolimbocortical dopamine system,
Okay.
you can think of it as the brain's pleasure highway.
The pleasure highway. Okay, I'm listening. So how does this highway get hijacked?
Well, picture this. This highway has two main routes.
Okay.
The mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways, they basically work together to process, reward and motivation. When we experience something pleasurable, like, let's say, eating some amazing food or finally hitting a goal at work, dopamine gets released along these pathways.
Dopamine, right. That's the feel-good chemical.
Exactly. It's all about pleasure and reward. And the thing is, drugs like alcohol, nicotine, even caffeine, they've figured out how to tap into this system. They basically flood it with dopamine.
So wouldn't that make us feel amazing all the time?
Well, that's where the hijacking happens. These drugs don't just gently nudge those dopamine levels up, they crank them up way too high. And the brain, it's not used to this level of dopamine, so it starts to adapt.
Adapt how?
Well, for one, it reduces your baseline dopamine activity, like turning down the volume on your pleasure dial. So everyday things that used to bring you joy, they don't really do it anymore. You need more and more of the drug to get that same feeling.
That's starting to sound a lot like, well, addiction.
It is, and that's just one piece of the puzzle. Another fascinating piece is something called sensitization.
Sensitization.
Yeah, so think about it like this. You're walking down the street and you smell those fresh-baked cookies. Suddenly, you're craving cookies like crazy, even though you weren't even thinking about them before. That's kind of what happens with drugs and sensitization.
So even just seeing, like, a beer commercial or smelling cigarette smoke, it can trigger those intense cravings.
Exactly. Your brains learn to associate certain cues with the drug, so those cues can trigger intense cravings, making relapse much more likely. It's like a powerful shortcut between the cue and wanting the drug.
That's kind of scary, to be honest. But if addiction is all about dopamine and reward, why doesn't everyone who tries, drugs become addicted? Is there something different about the brains of people who are more prone to addiction?
That's a great question. And the answer is, yeah, there are differences. One key factor is genetics.
So some people are just wired differently when it comes to addiction.
Exactly. About 50% of addiction vulnerability is hereditary. For example, there's something called the genetic addiction risk score. It's called KB220.
KB what?
KB220. It's based on variations in several genes that influence dopamine activity and reward functioning.
Wait, so you're saying we can actually look at someone's genes and kind of get a sense of their risk for addiction?
It's not quite that simple, but yeah, research is showing that certain genetic variations can make someone more susceptible.
That's incredible. So genes play a role, but it's not the whole story.
Wow.
What about the environment?
Absolutely. Environmental factors like stress, social pressures, even just access to drugs can play a huge role in whether someone develops an addiction. It's this complex interplay between nature and nurture.
So we've got this powerful reward system in our brains, and drugs can kind of hijack it, leading to addiction. But I'm curious, we talked about how drugs flood the brain with dopamine, but what happens when someone tries to, quit? Does the brain just go back to normal?
Well, unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. When someone stops using, especially after prolonged use, their brain goes through a period of withdrawal.
Ah, yes, withdrawal, those awful physical and emotional symptoms.
Exactly. And they can be really challenging.
Yeah.
Anxiety, insomnia, tremors, even nausea, and in severe cases, seizures.
So the brain's basically throwing a tantrum because it's not getting its fix.
Kind of. It's protesting the sudden absence of the drug, the one it's become dependent on. And these withdrawal symptoms, they can be so intense that a lot of people relapse just to make them stop.
A vicious cycle.
It is. And this is where understanding the reward system and those changes that occur with addiction becomes so crucial for finding effective treatment.
So there's hope for people struggling with addiction.
Absolutely. And that's actually what we're going to dive into next time. We'll explore the latest research on addiction treatment and the potential for new approaches, ones that target those specific brain circuits.
So we've laid the groundwork, but I kind of want to get more specific. How about we dive into how some of the most common drugs actually mess with this reward system.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So let's start with alcohol. It's one of the most widely used and unfortunately abused drugs out there.
Yeah, for sure.
So everyone knows alcohol can make you feel relaxed, even, euphoric. But
Yeah.
what's really going on in the brain, like at the chemical level?
Well, alcohol's a bit of a multitasker. It actually affects a bunch of neurotransmitter systems all at the same time. For example, it enhances the effects of GABA.
GABA, right? That's the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it's like alcohol's amplifying the chill-out signal.
Exactly. That's why people usually feel more relaxed and less anxious after a drink or two. But alcohol also suppresses glutamate,
It is.
an excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay, so it's like a double whammy, dialing down the go signals and ramping up the slowdown signals.
Right.
That explains, like, the slowed reaction time and slurred speech and all that stuff.
Precisely. But of course, we can't forget about the pleasurable side of drinking. And that's where the dopamine comes in.
Right. Alcohol triggers that dopamine release, particularly in that mesolimbic pathway,
Oh,
our pleasure highway. But we also know that, long-term heavy drinking, it can have some pretty serious consequences.
oh, absolutely. Chronic alcohol abuse can lead to major changes in the brain. I mean, like structure and function. It can shrink brain tissue and really impair cognitive abilities.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely not something to toast to. So let's move on to another popular and highly addictive substance, nicotine.
All right, so nicotine is the primary addictive ingredient in tobacco, and it targets a specific type of acetylcholine receptor called the nicotinic receptor.
Acetylcholine, that's involved in like muscle movement and other things too, I think. So does that explain why smokers get those little twitches sometimes?
Exactly. When nicotine activates those receptors in the peripheral nervous system, it can cause those muscle twitches, but its effects in the brain are much more profound. It's a really strong stimulant that increases alertness and boosts cognitive performance, but these effects are pretty short-lived, which leads to that, cycle of craving and withdrawal.
And then, of course, all the long-term health risks, lung cancer, heart disease, and so many more.
Yeah, definitely a dangerous habit. Okay, speaking of stimulants, how about we talk about caffeine? Sure.
It's in coffee and tea and chocolate. It's legal, socially acceptable, even celebrated. But is it really a, drug?
It absolutely is. Caffeine is a psychoactive drug. It affects our brain and behavior. And while it might not, carry the same stigma as some other drugs, it can definitely be addictive. And it has, noticeable effects on our brains.
So how does caffeine work its magic? Like, what's it doing up there?
Well, caffeine primarily works by blocking adenosine receptors.
Adenosine, doesn't that have something to do with sleep?
You got it. It's a neurotransmitter that promotes sleep and kind of suppresses arousal. So caffeine does the opposite. Blocking those adenosine receptors increases alertness and reduces fatigue. It can also enhance cognitive function, and these effects are mostly because of increased dopamine and acetylcholine release.
Interesting. So even our morning coffee involves the brain's reward system. What about those dreaded afternoon caffeine crashes? What's happening there?
Well, as the caffeine starts to wear off, the adenosine levels, they begin to rise again, and that can lead to, feeling tired, maybe a headache, having trouble concentrating.
It's like our brains are playing catch up, after being temporarily boosted by that caffeine. And if you're a regular caffeine drinker, I mean, your brain can become, dependent,
Cool.
leading to those withdrawal symptoms. Speaking of dependence, how about marijuana?
Okay, sure.
It's become super popular, and in many places it's legal now. But I'm kind of curious about the science behind it. Like, what's going on there?
So marijuana's main psychoactive ingredient is THC.
THC.
Yeah, it stands for tetrahydrocannabinol.
Oh, okay. So that's the stuff that gets people high.
Exactly. And THC binds to specific receptors in the brain, cannabinoid receptors.
Cannabinoid receptors, those are like naturally in our brains.
Yep. Our brains actually produce their own cannabinoids. They're called endocannabinoids, and they play a role in a bunch of different things like mood, appetite, and pain.
So marijuana is kind of hijacking a system that's already there in our brains.
That's a good way to put it. And THC's effects on these receptors are, pretty widespread, leading to a bunch of effects, from changes in sensory perception and mood to impaired memory and coordination.
It sounds like marijuana can really throw things off in the brain. Is it addictive, though?
Well, while it's considered less addictive than some other drugs like, heroin or cocaine, marijuana can definitely be habit-forming.
And I'm guessing long-term use can have some negative consequences, especially for developing brains.
You're absolutely right. Studies have shown that heavy marijuana use during adolescence can impair brain development, especially in areas that have to do with memory and attention.
Like it's interfering with the brain's wiring at a, really critical time. And those effects can be long-lasting, even if someone, stops using marijuana later in life.
That's why it's so important to understand the risks associated with, well, any drug use, especially during those crucial developmental years.
So we've covered a lot in this segment. Alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, marijuana. It's pretty clear that these drugs can have a big impact on our brains. But it's important to remember that, addiction is complicated. It's not just one thing. There's genetics, environment, and individual choices. All these things can contribute. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how these different drugs kind of hijack the brain's reward system. But what happens when someone, tries to break free from that cycle of addiction?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, that's for sure. We touched on some of the brain changes that happen with, chronic drug use, like reduced dopamine activity, sensitization to those drug cues, and hypofrontality, and all those things. They make it so hard to quit.
It's like the brain's been rewired
Yeah,
to make it harder to resist those cravings.
exactly. And then when someone tries to, stop using drugs, their brain goes through withdrawal,
Yeah.
especially after using for a long time.
Yeah, we've all heard about withdrawal, the anxiety, the insomnia. It can get pretty bad, right?
It really can. It's basically the brain's way of protesting, because it's not getting the drug it's become so dependent on. And these withdrawal symptoms, they can be so intense that a lot of people end up relapsing just to make them stop.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And this is where understanding the reward system and all the changes that happen, well, it's crucial for developing, effective treatments.
So how do we break that cycle? I mean, if the brain is essentially addicted, how do we help it heal?
Unfortunately, there's no magic solution. Treatment approaches really depend on the person and the specific drug, but typically it involves, different therapies, maybe medications, and support systems.
So it's not just about detoxing the body. You have to address all the other stuff, too.
Yeah, all the underlying psychological and behavioral stuff.
Right.
And there's actually some really promising research happening right now. In the field of addiction treatment, scientists are developing new medications that can help reduce cravings and manage those, those withdrawal symptoms. They're also looking into therapies that target the specific brain circuits involved.
So there's hope.
Absolutely. The more we learn about, the brain mechanisms behind addiction, the better we'll be at, developing those treatments.
That's great to hear. So I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We talked about how the reward system works, how drugs can kind of mess it up, the challenges of addiction and withdrawal, and the latest research on treatment. It's a complicated topic.
It is, and it's constantly, evolving.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up for today. I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of, all those complex connections between drugs, the brain, and behavior.
It's been a great discussion.
And remember, the more we learn about how drugs affect us, the better choices we can make, right? For ourselves and, for others who might be struggling. So keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.